I am Amanda Mahaffey. I'm a Deputy Director at the Forest Stewards Guild, and I'm also an Outreach Coordinator for the North Atlantic Fire Science Exchange. I think many of you are familiar with NAFSE, as our nickname or acronym is, but we work to catalyze collaboration between fire scientists and managers to create a safe and resilient fire-adapted North Atlantic landscape. We have a really great leadership team, really great colleagues and collaborators, and we're really glad that you could all be part of our community for today and join us for this webinar. We have a really great presentation ahead, and so I will cut the NAFSE introduction short. Maddie has put the link to our website in the chat window, so I encourage you to check us out and feel free to contact us for more information or become part of our community. So without further ado, I'm really excited today that we're going to be talking about trade-offs and opportunities with wildlife and carbon management within a pitch pine barrens case study. We have Caitlin Littlefield who will be joining us, or will be leading off our presentation, and also John Scanlon. Both of them bring a tremendous amount of knowledge and information about climate science, about climate adaptation, about carbon, about wildlife, and how all of these really nuanced parts of the ecosystem interact. So without further ado, I will let Caitlin take the floor, and I'll ask if you have questions, please type them into the chat window, and we will do our best to address them after the presentations conclude. Thank you and enjoy our talk.
Great, thank you, Amanda, and thanks folks for joining today. Really glad to be here, and as Amanda said, we'll be digging into some of the inherent trade-offs and possibility of opportunities for maximizing forest carbon while protecting biodiversity in some forest contexts, and how climate change adaptation, how using that framework can help to navigate some of those trade-offs. So I'll start off by giving a fairly broad overview of some of the principles associated with these trade-offs and climate change adaptation, and a peek into a couple unique forest systems in which these trade-offs are really apparent. And then I'll hand the mic over to John, who will give us a deeper dive into the pitch pine barrens systems. But before I get started, though, I do want to at least acknowledge one name who's not in the slide, and that's Tony D'Amato at UVM, and his insights were really crucial to the work that I'll be talking about today. And then certainly the managers across the Northern Forest region who have shared their time and expertise with me throughout this process. So let's first start with the big picture here. Everybody here knows the planet is warming up at unprecedented rate thanks to our burning of fossil fuels, conversion of natural land cover, especially forests. So for example, here in the Northeast and Great Lakes region, we're seeing some of the most significant departures in winter temperatures across the country over the past century, plus really highly variable precipitation. So periods of drought, periods of intense precipitation, and that has some big implications for forest health, as well as for example, the prescribed fire necessary to restore pitch pine barrens that John's going to be discussing later. Plus, of course, species are disappearing at alarming rates across the globe. And a lot of that is due to habitat loss and fragmentation, but also, especially in this neck of the woods, the loss of unique habitat conditions that had historically been maintained by disturbance. So in a recent study here, we based in the graph you see on the right there, we've lost an estimated 3 billion birds in North America over the past 50 years alone. And that decline is true across other taxa as well. Again, largely due to habitat loss, but also interacts and compounded by the stresses associated with climate change, like increasing drought, weather extremes, pests and pathogens, et cetera. So these two dual mutually reinforcing threats of climate change and biodiversity loss really compel us to act fast. So to swiftly curtail our greenhouse gas emissions and keep as much carbon out of the atmosphere and on the ground as possible, to also restore and prevent the continued loss of forests and woodland habitat, really all types of habitat, of course, and to steward our forests in a way that really helps them and the species therein to adapt to ongoing and upcoming threats. And to that point, I'll pause here to just distinguish between climate change mitigation, which is really about reducing carbon in the atmosphere, whereas helping our human and natural systems to respond to those impacts is climate change adaptation. On the climate change mitigation front, right, so keeping the carbon out of the atmosphere, we know that forests and woodlands themselves are just a super important natural climate solution through their tremendous capacity to sequester and store carbon. What the graph on the right shows is that if we do take advantage of these natural climate solutions through reforestation, avoided forest conversion, restoration across natural land covers, this could get us to about a third of the way of reaching our goal of keeping the globe from warming by less than 2 degrees. Of course, that has to be coupled with reducing fossil fuel use, and but forest carbon, in a nutshell, is hugely important across. It is an important part of the solution. But let's also remember there are tons of other ecosystem services and benefits that we derive from forests. So clean air, clean water, wood products, recreation, cultural resources. But carbon is, of course, the hot topic now. And certainly the public, policymakers, managers have taken note of the importance of this, and especially the public. And I think it's probably fair to say that parts of New England, and maybe especially Massachusetts, is perhaps ground zero for public opposition to active forest management because of the carbon potential of trees and forests. Of course, public opposition to active management is nothing new. And I show these pictures here of there's Wendell State Forest in Massachusetts, where a funeral was held a few years ago. The other photo in the lower right is from a park up here in Burlington, Vermont, where some unhealthy trees were being replaced. And I don't show these photos to disparage these protesters at all, but just to really highlight that society is taking note of the importance of photosynthesis. And so I think that's heartening on the one hand. It's just that in many ways, these people are allies in this effort to conserve and protect forest land. It's just that nuance about how we might also protect biodiversity is lost in some systems because active management may well be required in some of these contexts. And I think those in the forestry, natural resources, wildlife world could do a better job at helping communicate some of that nuance. Beyond this sort of general interest, we're seeing a great deal of engagement in forest carbon markets, and initiatives to plant millions, billions, trillions of trees, and just in general, a growing interest of keeping as much carbon on the ground in live trees as possible. So for example, what that might look like in some contexts is allowing some forests to mature and even actively promoting old forest characteristics that maintain ample standing and down dead wood. In these kind of conditions, live, dead, soil carbon pools all increase, for example, here in a northern hardwoods or mixed wood setting. And many wildlife species stand to benefit. Fisher, pine marten, pileated woodpecker, eastern redback salamander, many others. But the question I would pose today is, what about systems and unique habitat conditions in which strategies for maximizing forest carbon don't tightly align with the disturbance-oriented strategies needed to maintain certain habitat types for threatened and declining wildlife? And I've heard from many managers across the region, they're acutely aware of this question as pressures mount to avoid any management that seemingly compromises carbon storage, especially when we're talking about above ground tree biomass. And so,
Caitlin, oh, sorry to interrupt. I wonder if you could try to hold still a little bit or move a little bit closer to the mic. Some folks are hearing a little bit of muffled sound.
Sure, yeah.
Sorry to interrupt.
Oh, thank you. You know what? I'm just going to close the window as well. Give me 1 second.
Okay. Yeah, and if you're able to lean a little closer to the mic, that might help us get a little more consistent sound. Thank you.
Yeah, sure thing. Sorry about that, folks. Thanks for that, Amanda. This better? People can hear me okay?
It's okay so far. Thank you.
Okay, sure. All right, great. So back to this question of conditions or settings in which maximizing carbon storage don't tightly align with those efforts to restore key habitat. We'd suggest that the lens of climate change adaptation might help us to navigate that challenge. So what does that mean? Some of the principles of climate change adaptation being that we're anticipating the changes that are coming down the pike, whether we're certain about them or not. And so it, therefore, this lens of climate change adaptation prioritizes diversity and complexity at multiple spatial scales, as through replicating and mimicking natural disturbance regimes. It explicitly accounts for trade-offs. It's just inherently adaptive and dynamic, given these changes that are coming down the pike. And it really helps to accommodate multiple objectives, including wildlife habitat and carbon storage. And this is something that Tony and I encapsulated in a recent paper, and I believe Amanda will share the link to this if anybody's interested in seeing it. And so happy to share that around. And what we do in this as well is apply that kind of framework, that climate change adaptation framework, in several different contexts where the rubber really meets the road in terms of addressing these trade-offs between carbon and wildlife habitat. I've had the pleasure of sort of collecting stories from managers over the past 2 years across the region that, again, really encapsulate these potential trade-offs. And as I walk through each of these 4 case studies, I think what you'll see is that in most of these, a common theme is that disturbance, often fire, is what has historically maintained these unique habitat conditions. And it's often the lever by which we can maintain and restore these habitats moving forward. So let's first start off here talking about early successional habitat in New England's northern hardwoods. Here in Vermont, as elsewhere, roughly 80% of the landscape was denuded of forest during European settlement. And perhaps some of you have seen these dioramas at Harvard Forest that really demonstrate that dramatic change in the landscape over time. Now, of course, much of the landscape is forested again, but sort of in a middle age class, ecologically immature, if you will. We certainly don't have a lot of old forest, and we also don't have a lot of young forest. And in fact, there's less early successional forest habitat on the landscape now than prior to European settlement. Much of that had been maintained by succession in beaver meadows. We've largely reduced the influence of beavers. Other processes and agents that we've sort of dampened over time, ice scouring, now we have lots of flood control dams. We wiped out passenger pigeons that themselves and their consumption of vegetation and their guano would have affected woody plant growth, as well as indigenous people's agriculture and burning, and then other disturbance agents that would have maintained patchiness and heterogeneity across the landscape. Along with the decline in the early successional habitats of these forests that would have been maintained by these processes, we're also seeing a decline in many species, especially breeding birds that require this kind of young forest. So the chestnut-sided warbler, for example, has been declining in recent decades as we've lost overgrown fields and second growth forests have matured. They nest a few feet off the ground in patches, half acre or more. Same goes for the New England cottontail, obligate users of young stands. But because many of these early successional specialists take off after 5 to 10 years, we need to be actively promoting the patchwork of these habitats across the landscape. And again, we have ample middle-aged forests that we can reallocate to those conditions as well as the old forest conditions. And active forest management is likely the best lever that we have to do so as through patch cuts. Of course, doing so inherently reduces live above ground carbon stored on site. But creating that mosaic of conditions across the landscape not only helps maintain critical habitat for the species, but might also help serve as stepping stones as wildlife species and plant species track suitable climatic conditions into the future. And it just inherently affords a little bit more community reshuffling when you have a diversity of species and conditions. So again, this sort of habitat may reduce carbon stored at any given site, but that stand level trade-off is more than compensated for from a wildlife perspective and the broader climate adaptation perspective. So before we head west to a couple examples in the upper Midwest, I think it's worth stepping back to see how dramatically fire-maintained vegetation has changed throughout the eastern US. So vegetation that prior to European arrival is indicated in the map on the left there. You can see more oak hickory, oak pine, et cetera. But through development, agriculture, the preferential removal of certain species, and certainly fire exclusion, we've seen this pervasive shift from diverse fire-adapted communities to more fire-sensitive and dense forests, so mesification. And that's self-reinforcing as fire exclusion and denser conditions shifts the microclimate towards cooler and wetter, more shaded conditions. And then also in Midwestern open forests in particular, we've seen a continued densification as that fire has been excluded. So keep in mind those two trends as we head west, and it's something that, of course, John will revisit as well. So first example, sort of along the margin of the prairie and boreal forest is this quilt of prairie and woodland, these tall grass aspen parklands, which really reflect the legacy of glaciation, massive glacial lakes that drained 10,000-ish years ago. And so this lake bottom, because of the inherently peaty soil and wet conditions, had historically precluded a lot of tree development. But as these areas have been filled in and ditched for agriculture, and as fire has been excluded, we've seen a lot of tree encroachment, especially of aspen. So historically, elk were really common throughout this area. Caribou were to the east. Both species were extirpated, and only in the past few decades have elk numbers crept back. And this is really ideal elk habitat. So it's a mosaic of woodland cover that provides protection and movement corridors, and then also open areas for foraging. Other species like sandhill cranes that would nest in wet shrubby habitat, sharp-tailed grouse that use open areas, burn patches within the matrix for their breeding grounds, mating grounds. Those unique conditions are what we were striving to restore as well, and to maintain those tree islands, but also that ample brushy habitat. And so that's through shearing and mowing, larger patch cuts, prescribed burns, etc. And then helping native ungulates regain a foothold that also can help keep the tree encroachment in check. Of course, keeping tree encroachment in check means basically foregoing the chance to maximize carbon stored in live above ground trees. But the uniqueness of this biome and these habitat conditions are worth that carbon trade-off to support these species. And we also know that diverse native grasses can sequester a huge amount of carbon below ground. So in maintaining and promoting this quilt of prairie, brushy bogs, and tree islands, we may not be sacrificing as much carbon as would be apparent at first glance. Again, it's also maintaining that patchiness and variability at the landscape scale that not only supports wildlife, but just inherently increases the ability of this landscape to respond to oncoming threats far more so than a homogeneous sea of aspen wood, for instance. So now just a little bit further to the south, and here's an example from Michigan anyway, this is a context in which you really see how apparent that trend of mesification is. So in oak savanna natural communities, or what remains of them, these would have historically been maintained by repeated low intensity fire, working in concert with droughty periods. And it's some of the most threatened systems in North America. Canopy cover would have been 10 to 50%, 60% of oaks, hickories, other locally abundant species that would have maintained many of the adaptations that are required to persist in a fire-prone setting. So, for example, deep taproots of oaks that are ready to sprout as soon as fire comes back through. And that species like this, for example, eastern box turtle, would have crawled down along that, hunkered down along the taproots of those oaks to burrow during hibernation. Other reptiles would have really benefited from that patchiness, that green and black patchiness maintained by fire as well. Also, such fires would promote wild blue lupine, which of course the larvae of federally endangered Cardinal blue butterfly feed upon. So yet again, here's an instance in which thinning and reintroducing fire may be critical to maintaining that internal vegetative patchiness and high levels of grass and forb diversity. Plus, that of course deters the encroachment of saplings and shrubs. Fire directly consumes biomass and is therefore represents a pulse of carbon. But yet again, this is an instance in which maximizing live above ground carbon is incompatible with maintaining the critical habitat. But reintroducing disturbance and creating that variability can help confer resilience to this kind of landscape in the face of climatic changes, in addition to other threats coming down the pike. And then, so finally, I won't dwell too long on pitch pine barrens, because John will really dig into it. But this, as he'll describe, is a globally imperiled system. Pitch pine overstories, thickets of scrub, blueberries, etc. And so decades of almost total fire suppression have really transformed these landscapes and enabled white pine in particular to displace pitch pine, which John will get at, not to mention the plantations of red pine especially. And there are a number of rare and dwindling species, especially invertebrates in these systems, that rely on the pine barrens. So Barron's buck moth, Barron's tiger beetle, the frosted elfin butterfly, and it's thought that the recent decline in whippoorwills over the past few decades is largely attributable to a general reduction in these invertebrates. So restoration in these settings, as John will talk about, involves removing unhealthy red pine plantations, restoring fire, and again, that combustion, of course, represents a pulse of carbon, and the pursuit of lower stocking in general does too. But we're restoring these habitats for these declining species. And reducing density in these kind of stands could help reduce that drought stress, which in turn increases tree resilience to other threats, for example, southern pine beetle. And in reducing fuel loads, we may reduce a more kind of catastrophic pulse of carbon into the future. So I think what we've seen in each of these four examples then is that if we maintain and restore disturbance and zoom out to that broader scale, thinking about diversity and heterogeneity at the landscape level, that's one way in which we can help, ultimately keep carbon on the ground, but also maintain species habitat and support these systems and sort of steward them into this era of unknown changes. And in really expressly accounting for the trade-offs and not becoming so attached to a particular objective like carbon, it can help us, I think, navigate and steer ourselves away from no regrets management and towards no regrets management, excuse me, and avoid some of the maladaptive practices that that might appear shiny and the right thing to do at first glance, but in fact lead to some unintended consequences. And I'll touch briefly on just a couple of those in the context of our pursuit of a low carbon economy, which absolutely we need to shift away from fossil fuel use. That's paramount to avoiding the worst impacts of climate change. But let's make sure we're doing it in a strategic manner that accounts for some of the unintended consequences. So for example, we know that ridgeline wind can have a pretty major impact on birds and bats. So let's do that strategically and think about placement. New England alone has lost thousands of acres of forest to solar development. And so as we think about the incentives associated with promoting renewable energy, let's really make sure we're getting those incentives right so that we don't end up losing more forest to, for example, solar arrays. So beyond just that policy piece too, we're thinking about renewable energy. I think that we also need to be thinking carefully about folding in a recognition of biodiversity into our existing carbon programs. Forest carbon programs can and should expressly account for and maybe even reward a greater consideration of habitat and wildlife. As we think about removals during restoration, and John, again, we'll get at this, let's make sure that some of that wood is going towards long-term carbon storage and harvested wood products, or at the very least, displacing fossil fuel use through biomass. And then, of course, this is no news, but we also must continuously work to help increase public comprehension of some of these nuances of how ecological forest management, which might mean a parent sacrifice of carbon in the long term, can help us support wildlife, carbon, and increase resilience to the climatic changes coming down the pike. There's, related to that, there's ample room for both passive and active management in pursuing a resilient forested landscape. But I think above all, the lesson I take away from all of this is that in the context of forest management and forests, that we really ought not be tied down by one single objective like carbon, because in the context of forests, simplification is rarely beneficial. And with that, I'll hand it over to John, who will speak to the uniqueness and some of the challenges associated with pitch pine barren restoration in this era of climate change. So John, I'll hand the mic over to you.
Okay, well, hey everyone, and thank you, Caitlin, for that introduction. I'm not an ecologist, and my job here is to bring the perspective of a habitat manager. And with that, we can go ahead, Caitlin. This is how I have often felt during my career. Like literally, I was engaged in a tug of war with the public, and it's really too bad. I don't think it has to be that way, but it's more than just who gets to win an argument, because really we are these issues that we're involved with today, conservation of biological diversity and mitigating climate change, they honestly do have global importance and global impact. And I don't think it has to be a fight all the time. And hopefully, as we move along today, I can tell you why. Okay, so why are we focused on pitch pine barrens? They're a dime a dozen, ain't they? Well, not exactly. Pitch pine barrens are in fact a globally uncommon natural community, and we're fortunate to really have the lion's share of the Earth's barren systems here along the East Coast. And I think with that privilege of having these systems comes a pretty big conservation responsibility to conserve them and make sure they continue to maintain their full native biological diversity. If we go down to New Jersey, you can see that there is both public conservation agencies and private conservation groups that are working together to conserve over 1 million acres of pine barrens in New Jersey, and I think that just speaks to the importance of this unique community type. All right, so in Massachusetts, the biggest effort, the most extensive effort for pitch pine barrens restoration is in the southeast part of the state, in the town of Plymouth, in what's generally referred to as the Miles Standish Complex, because the heart of it is in the Miles Standish State Forest. In this area, go ahead, Caitlin. There you go. All right. Right now, there's about 2,400 acres that is being restored, but really, in some ways, the sky's the limit. There's probably 4,000 or 5,000 acres that could ultimately be restored to functional pine barrens. And there just aren't that many places where you can see this kind of habitat. And it's not only the biodiversity value of restored pitch pine barrens that's important, it also truly does substantially reduce the risk to human health and safety from wildfires, and it can provide some awesome recreational opportunities. So let's look at this project just a little more. Again, it's a cooperative project between the Department of Conservation and Recreation, Bureau of Forestry, and Mass Wildlife. There are two folks down there that I want to give a quick shout out to, who are boots on the ground making this happen, and that is Paul Gregory, DCR Management Forester, and Fletcher Clark, habitat biologist with Mass Wildlife. And let's just go through a sequence of pictures. This one I really like because it shows the before condition on the right, the result of human fire exclusion. And on the left, you're seeing the initial mechanical treatment, which is large mulching equipment. So all of the trees that were there are still there, but they're in the form of mulch on the ground. And you have to be really careful about not putting too much mulch on the ground, because that will prevent future prescribed fire use. But if you take a look at that section on the right, that's not a very fire safe situation. So here in this one, you can see where there's been a lot of mechanical mulching work done, but even though you're seeing a lot of mulch, that will still ultimately burn. In the next photo, this shows an area of the Miles Standish complex that had a lot of white pine in it. Caitlin talked to us about mesification before, and what tends to happen, certainly in Massachusetts, is that under fire exclusion, white pine ultimately replaces pitch pine, and you're moving from an open canopy pitch pine barren to a closed canopy white pine forest. So the larger trees cannot be mulched. I mean, there is, believe it or not, equipment that's capable of mulching a large white pine tree, but that would put way too much mulch on the ground. So all the down trees you're seeing in that picture in the lower left were removed with large grapple skidders, and that allows the finished product there you go, to come into view. And this is 2 years after the mechanical work was completed, ready to burn. Okay, so let's get into the carbon aspect. Oh, I'm sorry, geez, I was stressing the public-private partnership in New Jersey and New York. It occurs here in Massachusetts as well. Mass Wildlife and DCR are the public conservation agencies that are mostly involved, but there's an awesome dedicated group, the Southeast Mass Pine Barrens Alliance, that has really done a lot of heavy lifting to get this type of restoration work accepted, in the eastern part of the state. In fact, they have formed an even wider coastal pine barrens partnership that involves a lot of local private conservation groups. And again, the interest in both public and private conservation groups just speaks to the importance of this unique habitat type. Okay, so let's get into the forest carbon storage aspects. I want to start with forest as a whole across Massachusetts. This is U.S. Forest Service forest inventory analysis data, and it shows the 5 major forest carbon pools, okay? Not surprisingly, the biggest carbon pool is the live above ground vegetation, the trees that we see. But I really want to point out that the second largest carbon pool is the soil itself, and it's totally out of sight, and a lot of people don't even think about it. And as we drill down into the pitch pine barrens, the importance of the soil carbon pool is going to really play out. Okay, so these are the percentages, but what about the volume? How much carbon is there, you know, in a forest? Okay, Caitlin. We're going to look at this excellent booklet by Paul Catanzaro and Tony D'Amato on forest carbon. They looked at 4 major forest types in the eastern forest, and I just have one of them shown here. The oak pine type is closest to what we're talking about, of course. So you see the same 5 soil carbon pools, and in terms of volume, how much carbon is there in a forest? Well, in 70 to 80-year-old, fully stocked, full canopy, oak pine forest, you've got an average of about 82 metric tons per acre. All right. Now, in a restored pine barrens, you're going to have substantially less, in that pine barrens, when they're fully functional, are very much an open canopy with perhaps 12 to 20 trees per acre. This graphic you're looking at here for the full canopy, fully stocked 70 to 80 year old oak pine forest has well over 100 trees per acre. All right. Now, I wasn't able to find a published number for the open canopy, you know, restored pine barrens, but based on some research work that I'm aware of, I'm going to hazard a guess that it's the value for open canopy pitch pine barrens is about a quarter of this number. So let me just hazard a guess at plus or minus 20 metric tons per acre in a functional restored pine barrens habitat. And I think it's important to set that number because this is an excellent article that if you have anyone who's interested in barrens management, I would encourage you to go look at it. In the New Jersey pine barrens, across the major upland barrens types, all right, basically they determined that a prescribed fire on average releases about 1.9 metric tons per acre of carbon. All right. So in terms of scale, if an intact functioning pine barrens has a total carbon volume of about 20 metric tons per acre, and again, that has yet to be fully borne out in published research, but I think it's in the ballpark. That means that a prescribed fire is releasing about 10% of the carbon within that natural community. So the folks who claim that shouldn't be burning because it's releasing all kinds of carbon, well, it does release carbon, but you know, plus or minus perhaps 10% of the total carbon in the system. Now, importantly, that carbon is resequestered pretty quickly, just in a matter of 2 to 3 growing seasons. You're right back to where you were before the burn, right? Now, because the prescribed burn interval is longer than 2 to 3 years, and the New Jersey pine barrens is typically 5 to 8 years, that means you have some additional years in which you can sequester and store carbon in both the soil and the understory. But again, the key is the soil carbon pool is building. Now let's take a look at this with one graphic from this paper. This is looking at net carbon dioxide exchange. You're looking over several years, and this is showing two different prescribed fires, all right? And not surprisingly, the drop in carbon after a burn takes 2 to 3 years to recover. But again, beyond that, you have 3 or 4 additional years where you are increasing carbon, especially in the soil pool. That means as you move from the beginning of one prescribed fire period to the next, which is that dashed blue line at the bottom, you start the next prescribed fire period with more carbon in the system, especially more carbon in the soil. Okay, so back here, and there's just one more point then to make on this slide, and that is basically that the public concern that prescribed fire means a net increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere just really is not the case. The carbon that's released is quickly resequestered, and there is a slow increase in the soil carbon pool, and that is critical. And so at the landscape level, there really isn't much of an effect on carbon dynamics. Certainly, prescribed fire management in pitch pine barrens does not appear to result in any net long-term increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. This is another good paper that focuses on the soil organic level. And again, there's a lot of concern that prescribed fire is a liability, but the literature really is saying otherwise. Okay, and the key here is that prescribed fire is a low intensity fire. I really can't stress that enough. And it works in terms of carbon budgets when it's kept at a low intensity and kept out of the soil layer, okay? The dense shrub layer in pitch pine barrens really love fire. They respond vigorously. The root growth of scrub oak, huckleberry, lowbush blueberry, they pump a lot of carbon into the soil. And one of the many benefits of prescribed burns is that they really reduce the likelihood of severe wildfires. And quickly, I meant to mention that not only do we want to keep fire out of the soil to avoid carbon loss, anybody who has ever worked on a prescribed fire knows that you want to keep fire out of the soil. Otherwise, you're going to be on mop-up duty for days and days on end. And I'm just as glad those days are behind me. Okay. Go ahead to the next slide, Caitlin. All right, back to Plymouth for a second. We had this slide up before because I posed the question, well, do we really need to worry about wildfires here on the East Coast? I mean, I'm sitting here in Massachusetts. This ain't California, right? But the reality is, let's look what happened here back when I was a little kid. Okay, this 15,000 acre or more wildfire was a running ground fire that only stopped because it hit Cape Cod Bay. Right, and you want to talk about carbon release, the avoidance of periodic wildfires and not only the habitat damage, but the carbon release. Prescribed fire can really, truly help avoid the situation we're looking at right here. All right, so there's just one more bullet. Go ahead, Caitlin, to put on here, and that is that not only does prescribed fire in pitch pine barrens habitats not result in a net increase of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere over time, it actually has real potential to be a nature-based solution for increasing carbon storage, especially in the carbon soil pool. All right, so we'll finish up here with some more on trade-offs. Caitlin talked to us before about the ongoing mesification. When you exclude fire from pitch pine barrens, they get moister and they get more nutrient rich, and ultimately the open canopy pitch pine is replaced by closed canopy white pine. Okay, so you go from a situation where you have 12 to 20 pitch pine trees per acre to 100 to 120 white pine trees. Now on the right hand side, you can see the range of eastern white pine on the top and the range of pitch pine on the bottom, and you can see that the eastern white pine totally covers the distribution of pitch pine. Now, a couple important factors about white pine. We can grow white pine anywhere. Okay, we truly can. It grows on almost any soil within its range, but it competes best on, well, guess what? Well-drained, sandy soils that are textbook pine barrens. Okay. Another thing about carbon benefits of white pine is that unlike some other trees, it can achieve, maximum growth with less than 50% full sunlight. Okay. So that's, again, you're moving from that open canopy pine barrens to a closed canopy white pine forest. And not only can it grow in dense stocking, white pine continues to grow very rapidly and to rapidly sequester carbon for pop quiz time. So if anybody is still awake and paying attention, how many years, over how long a period does white pine continue to grow rapidly and to rapidly sequester carbon? Anybody, go ahead and type your answers into the chat box. We'll come back to this in a second. But first, I want to go back to that awesome Catanzaro D'Amato publication and look at how, at what age do most forests maximize their carbon sequestration. Total carbon storage is greatest in old growth forest, okay, shown with the outer brown circle. You can see it's darkest, meaning indicating heaviest carbon storage in old growth forest. But the sequestration rate shown in the inner green circle, the darkest part of that is in the younger forest, small saw timber stage, basically 30 to 70 years of age, right? So that's important, but it doesn't count for all forests. There is an important exception, and that is our friend eastern white pine. Go ahead, Caitlin. All right. So we saw this before. Amanda, what did you get in the chat box for answers? Anything?
A few
Any guesses?
Yeah, a few brave
I'm
souls.
sorry?
We have 150 plus years, 200 years, 60 years. We have a second on the 150 plus also. Brian Hawthorne says culmination of mean annual increment is about 50 years. Then we also have 70 years. So those are the guesses we have so far.
Okay, very good. Go ahead, Caitlin. According to the U.S. Forest Service documents that I got into, it's about 200 years of age, not 30 to 70. White pine can continue to grow at a pretty rapid rate and sequester a lot of carbon up until about 200 years of age. So bottom line is, the reality is that our barrens sites, if you exclude fire, you have the potential to sequester and store a boatload of carbon. All right, quickly, this site index graph for white pine is just showing the vertical line from a base age of 50 years, says that on the worst sites, white pine will reach a height of about 60 feet in its over the first 50 years. On the best sites, it reaches a height of about 120 feet. Go ahead, Caitlin, just put on the two we're going to look at where pine barrens fit into this, and we'll also just give you the information on where, what kind of sites are best for white pine. It's riparian sandy loams, okay? So there's but even a site index of 80 is nothing to sneeze at for white pine. But again, we can grow white pine anywhere, and our barren sites are not the most productive for white pine. And I just got to show this old photo from the 1950s Forest Service publication. I'm sure the photo was from way before the 1950s. When I first started out in forestry, I remember the old timers telling me that white pine grew best if you can control competition, and it loves to have the tips of its toes just into the water. All right, we'll finish up here. We saw this image before. Does it have to be a tug of war? I really don't think so. And I'm going to end with a question for you all. And again, if Graves polls, I would like you to type your answer into the chat box. Are we really willing to trade the biodiversity value of pitch pine barrens for the potential carbon storage if we allow white pine to take over these sites? I know what my answer is, but I'd like to hear from you. So with that, I'll turn it back to Amanda and take a few questions.
Okay, thank you so much for that, John, and thank you, Caitlin. Oh boy. So, Caitlin, if you're able to turn your camera back on, we have a few questions that have come in the chat window. So first I'll point out, Maddie did put John's last question into the chat. So again, please feel free to type your answers. Should we trade the biodiversity value of globally imperiled pine barrens for the carbon storage benefits of white pine on barren sites? So please feel free to type your answers. So with that, I'm going to go to our first question that came in. Some of this was addressed, but the question was, how much do burned versus unburned landscapes maintain underground carbon storage, root systems, underground fungi, and are those differences, if any, part of the conversation?
Yeah, sure. I can speak a little bit more broadly to thinking about fire ecology and changing fire regimes beyond even just these systems here. I think to a degree, the below ground component is still in some ways a bit of the wild west, if you will, but one thing that we're still resolving is as we're seeing more intensive fire effects and in some cases sterilization of soil as we see more and more severe fires in some places, that's changing what might otherwise have been a fairly straightforward carbon equation for at least the few initial layers of below ground material. But I'd say, and John, please chime in here, but I think we're still resolving the below ground dynamics to some degree. But certainly, as we're in the kind of fires that John's talking about here, the lower severity, that can result in an accumulation, accretion of carbon over time.
Yeah, very right. I would second that, and I think my analogy is that soil carbon gets released. You can picture it the same as rocks popping up in agricultural fields. When you break that surface infrastructure of the top organic layer in the soil, the root structure, not only do you get rocks coming up into your fields, frost heaved up, but there's carbon coming out too. So, to try to answer the question more directly, prescribed burning, again, low intensity, keep it out of the soil, keeps that root structure intact. Not only does it keep it intact, but it stimulates it. All right. So I really think prescribed fire, really, I think it's going to turn out that it really does a great job of keeping soil carbon in the soil. Logging operations, if you're breaking through the soil, you're releasing carbon for a time until that root structure regrows.
All right, thank you both for your responses. The next question came in from Ivan. So regarding pine barrens restoration, he's wondering, are the post-restoration photos, I think, John, from your slide, really indicative of the historical tree density? Have the remaining trees survived and thrived? Are there any issues with sun or wind damage from suddenly losing their neighbors?
Yes, very, very good question. And the answer is yes, there is some issue with that. We honestly, at least in the Miles Standish complex, we haven't seen a lot of wind throw in the retained pitch pine, but that is because we purposely select the best, the healthiest, the most full crown trees that have the most intact root systems. But it can happen. And in terms of how does a like that picture on the screen now compared to historical conditions, man, I will leave that to the historians and the forest ecologists. I think it's always interesting to look at pre-colonial conditions, but what counts is maintaining species diversity on today's landscape that has been so heavily modified by human activity.
Awesome, thank you for that. I'll say in New Jersey that sometimes it's hard to kill the pitch pine, because then what did I learn a few weeks ago? The old timers would say that if you can, if a crow could nest, I think in remaining branches after a prescribed fire, then the tree will come back. So that's that's what they say in New Jersey. So another question that had come in from Molly, for rapid white pine sequestration over its lifetime, is that on a per tree basis or on a forest level basis, taking into account density, competition, et cetera? So Tony, if you're out there, I might actually pitch this question to you if you're able to turn on your camera and respond to Molly's question. I think you had a quick comment on that.
Yeah, Molly, good observation there. It is actually kind of a little bit tricky in that individual tree growth increases over time. You know, it's kind of like a Russian stacking doll. You keep putting wood increment. And so if we look at individual tree biomass growth, most of our species, you know, will really keep growing at really rapid rates, even past 150, 200 years old at the individual tree level. But at the stand level, similar to what Brian pointed out with mean annual increment, in terms of like ecosystem productivity and sequestration, that really peaks with white pine. Again, you're looking at, depending on the site quality, anywhere from 60 to 90 years old of age. So at the stand level, that growth is peaking, but at the individual tree level, there certainly are those dominant trees are still growing at really high rates. So good catch there, but definitely stand scale, it would not be growing at a high rate at 150, 200 years old.
Awesome, thank you for that. So let's see, so I think next in line, Helen has a question. So Helen, I think you are able to unmute. We'd love to hear your question.
Yep, thank you so much. Great presentation, and I really appreciate the information about carbon and prescribed fire, and I hope that we'll be able to get those links to those papers and websites after the presentation. My question, so I'm doing pitch pine barrens management, and I really like doing it. And I'm also doing a little bit of early successional habitat management. And yet with that and other parts of my forestry work, I have kind of a constant nagging feeling about climate change. And I find it hard to dismiss the critiques from the public, even though I recognize that they're minimally informed, you know, but having what comes up for me often is having done some emergency medical treatment kind of training. I just feel like we're looking at a mass casualty event across all species, but part of my training in that context is that you have to do triage, and you have to accept that you can't save everything. And so you have to have some criteria for what to put resources into and what not to put resources into, and things that are critical for the whole system have to be saved. Things that are savable are more important. Like there's no point saving things that are going to be gone anyway because of the totality of the situation, or because of the severity of the situation for that species or that person if it's medical. So I feel like it's easy for foresters to kind of dismiss public critique by saying they're uninformed, but I think there's a certain amount of head in the sand about that, just not being willing to recognize how serious the situation is, and that we don't have the privilege of going back or even maintaining things exactly as they are. They are changing. So we have to figure out how to work with that. So that I would love to hear commentary on that, but I also just always am feeling a need to say that. Thanks so much.
Helen, thanks. I'll chime in response. That's a great comment. And I do think you're absolutely right that we are going to be past the point of no return for many species, and we need to start kind of triaging. I think that my biggest concern these days is the simple adherence to that single objective of carbon. So to use your analogy of emergency medicine treatment, that's like taking care of the broken leg or trying to heal that when your jugular's sprouting blood. So I think we need to take a holistic look and think about the sort of the template on which we're operating, and ensure that there is diversity and complexity, which we know will confer more resilience. And so taking care of all pieces of the puzzle. And I just fear that there is an overemphasis on carbon alone when we have a huge number of other benefits that we derive from forests. And so you're 100% right that it certainly wasn't my intention to dismiss the concerns of the public, who I think are in many cases, very well informed and bring that passion to protecting our forest lands. But to pursue only a single objective is what my primary concern is surrounding carbon anyway. But thank you for that comment, though. I appreciate that.
I'll just throw in really quickly that I understand where Helen is coming from. So we need to do a couple of things. Caitlin hit on this in her part of the presentation, where we need to increase the amount of carbon and harvested wood that goes into long-term storage, long-term wood products. Right now in Massachusetts, at least, we're somewhere between 30 and 50% of the carbon that's harvested in forest cutting operations goes into long-term products. We need to increase that substantially, and we can through things like mass timber products. But an important point is that across all forest lands in Massachusetts, public or private, there is a net annual increase in total carbon storage, even with the harvesting that's going on. And if we stopped harvesting in Massachusetts, what are you going to replace the wood with? Where's it going to come from? All right. We got exporting the negative impacts of harvesting onto somebody else's forest. Okay, because each of us uses look at that picture, about one of those trees. Each of us uses one of those trees every year. So what are you going to replace the wood with if you're going to stop harvesting? And the other thing is, from the biodiversity side of the coin, carbon mitigation, climate mitigation is a huge, important ecosystem service, but so is biodiversity conservation. And I don't know if I want to live in a world without the wolves, as Leopold would say.
All right, thank you for that. So Jake, I see your hand is up. I think you were the next. Would you like to unmute and pose your question or comment?
Thank you. Yeah, I wanted to tear off of that triage comment, and then what Caitlin and John were saying. And typically we're seeing that tug of war that John described when we're talking about either habitat or carbon sequestration. And that tends to really lose the true ecological complexity of the situation. And that's a big problem I see when we're getting input from activist groups or the public, because oftentimes the public is fed this simple dynamic as well, or this trade-off, and that completely loses the aspect of climate resilience. We just had our great conference about southern pine beetle. There's all these other pests. There's all these storm stresses and drought stresses we're having now. And the way we build that climate resilience is using the same exact tools with a bit of variability in prescription, to do our barrens management. And so there has to be a focus on that resilience and how that interacts between habitat and sequestration. And typically that's going to also then have the benefit of increasing crown ratios of the leaf trees, providing for the healthier trees, because another thing that's typically missed in this discussion, particularly with the public, is the land use history and site condition that we're dealing with. We were dealt a particular hand as land managers. And oftentimes, particularly in New England, that condition is that an area was completely cut over and then just allowed to regenerate with extremely high tree densities, low tree vigor, low crown ratios. And if we go in there and we do some of this barrens restoration work, we're providing for those healthier tree conditions. And then at the same time, we're providing for that community safety aspect, which is so important in these pine barren systems. So bringing it back to that fire piece, if we're just going to long-term let this transition over those 200 or 300 years into, white pine, that whole time series is now going to have these disasters in there, whether those are wildfires, major tree loss from pests that are then followed by wildfires and all of that. So I should stop talking and let somebody else go, but basically it's what we often miss, particularly with the public, because they don't want to hear complexity, is that this is an extremely complex situation that takes our whole toolbox as conservation planners and land managers. So that triage, I think we all as conservationists here feel that stress. But these tools that we're using to provide this barrens habitat are the same tools we need to be providing these climate solutions. And it's not that tug of war, it's that all of this plays an important role. And it's not just a single species either that we're triaging for, it's that we're providing this entire remnant ecosystem. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that comment, Jake. I think that's a nice way to summarize. We did get an additional comment that also summarizes well from Thomas Brule saying thank you, Caitlin and John, and this should stir some healthy dialogue regarding societal needs, desires for biodiversity, carbon, recreation, and forest products. So there's a lot in here. Well, a lot of people have stuck around. I really appreciate everyone's time. Jeff Horan had a question about fire return intervals. Maybe we'll take that one quickly. So Jeff asked in the chat, what is the fire interval you are shooting for in your pine barrens forest? Interesting to look at the pitch pine pygmy forest in the high coastal plain in New Jersey, where trees are 6 feet tall with a 3 to 5 year fire return interval. So John, what have you been shooting for fire return intervals?
Well, again, I would love to have one of the fire ecologists comment on that. The article that I showed some information out of from the New Jersey Pine Barrens stated that the return fire interval was between 5 and 8 years. I think in the Miles Standish complex, for example, or some of the inland situations like the Montague Plains Barrens that Brian Hawthorne has done so much excellent work at. Maybe Brian can chime in on this. I think the average preferred fire return interval is probably less than that 5 to 8 years in that one article. But I would guess 3 to 6 maybe. But again, I'm just a dirt forester. I would love for some of the fire ecologists who are in attendance to chime in on that.
So
Thank you.
since I heard my name, this is Brian Hawthorne, I'll just jump in here. At Montague Plains and also in the Southeast Pine Barrens, what we're looking at for fire return intervals really is quite variable. So in areas where we have more grassland present, we're looking at much shorter intervals, as short as 1 to 3 years. In areas which are shrub dominated, we're looking at more along the sort of 3 to 6 year interval that John was mentioning. And in areas where we have significant amounts of overstory trees, such as in the Pine Barrens, we're looking at an even closer to New Jersey's you know, 5 to 8 years and potentially even longer. We try to maximize the variability within any of our areas so that we're not trying to, you know, stick to a very strict, rigid fire regime. It's going to be based on the response of the trees and of the vegetation within that. So that's a long way of saying it depends.
Great forester answer. Thank you, Brian. I know we're definitely over time, and I realize I skipped over Courtney's question, so this would go to anybody, but has there been any comparison research to show changes in soil carbon storage conditions for prescribed fire versus mechanical treatments, and especially in the Northeast specifically? I did recommend to Courtney to get in touch with Ken Clark, but I don't know if any of you have any quick answers on soil carbon, which is slightly different from what we talked about so far.
Yeah, geez, I'm sorry. I don't. I understand the question, and it's a good one. And I would say, yeah, call Ken. He's awesome.
Yep, call Ken. And I mentioned also Joe O'Brien from the Southern Research Station. I believe is just beginning to look into this as well. All right, we are 10 minutes after the top of the hour. Thank you to our participants for sticking around. Thank you so much to our hosts for our speakers for sticking around and keeping this dialogue going. Hopefully we can get together in the field for a field trip someday soon and look at pitch pine barrens and wildfire resiliency and ecosystem resiliency and climate adaptation and carbon mitigation.